Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the corruption trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan underway in Chicago and the status of the state's gun and magazine ban. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. It's now up to a federal judge to decide what's in store for Illinois' gun and magazine ban. Closing arguments were filed in the Southern District of Illinois Federal Court of Judge Stephen McGlynn by late Monday. McGlynn gave litigants that deadline at the conclusion of last month's 4-day bench trial in the case. Plaintiffs argue the law violates the Second Amendment for a variety of reasons, including banning firearms commonly owned for self-defense. The state argued the banned guns are too similar to military firearms and not useful for self-defense. The state also asked McGlynn to issue a stay on any possible permanent injunction to let them appeal. Gun rights advocate Todd Vandermeide said that's telling.
Our arguments are so bad, please give us a chance to get to the Court of Appeals. That's what it says. I mean, they're reading the room the same way I'm reading the room, I guess.
McGlynn's expected to issue a ruling soon. It's unclear when that could be. Whatever the outcome, it's expected to be appealed to the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Wiretap conversations have taken center stage at the corruption trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and co-defendant Michael McClain. Jim Talamonte has more.
With FBI Special Agent Ryan McDonald on the witness stand, prosecutors played a series of recordings. In one, McClain told lobbyist Stephanie Voyas about a coffee shop conversation with, quote, one of the ComEd people.
Speaker this and the speaker that and the speaker this and the speaker that, and right next to her at the table was Tiffany Madigan.
Oh.
And so suffice it to say, about 2 weeks later, she was no longer working for ComEd.
In a recording from November of 2018, Madigan and McClain discussed, quote, lowering the boom on State Representative Lou Lang shortly before Lang resigned. The trial is scheduled to resume Monday at the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago. I'm Chip Talamonte.
Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Thursday, October 24th. Opening arguments in the federal corruption trial of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and co-defendant Michael McClain are over, and several prosecution witnesses have testified, including some old but familiar names. Joining me to discuss this is Greg Bishop, Associate Illinois Editor. Greg, on the stand today was former Madigan House Floor Leader and former State Representative Lou Lang. Long followed former State Representative Scott Drury, both of whom you covered during their years in the state legislature. Bring our listeners up to speed with what's the latest at trial.
So we're kind of hearing some rehash of the ComEd 4 trial from last year, where 4 individuals in connection with this nearly 10-year-long bribery scheme involving ComEd and the former Illinois House Speaker. A lot of the testimony and the evidence thus far has been similar to what was featured in the ComEd trial. So some undercover recordings, in particular with Lou Lang and Madigan's co-defendant Michael McClain. talking about how Lang should step down. This was all in the context of a 2019 harassment allegation against Lang. If you recall, we were on the ground at the Capitol covering that, and it was pretty scandalous. But ultimately, that was featured during the testimony this week when Lou Lang got up on the stand. And Lang talked about how Madigan was the most powerful person in the General Assembly. He would be the person deciding what would move forward when it comes to legislation. But this phone call between Mike McClain and Lou Lang, pretty revealing in that it had McClain talking about how he's just an agent for our friend, quote unquote, and saying that it's time for Lang to find another career. And there was even evidence in the ComEd trial of McClain talking with Madigan, undercover, recordings, wiretap recordings of the two of them discussing Lang's future, and Madigan asking, does he have a place, especially with all of the harassment allegations circling around Lang. So that was revealed during the testimony this week. You also had Scott Drury, the former Democrat state representative who served in the state house. And I remember talking with him years ago when he was in the General Assembly, how he didn't support Madigan. He had some questions about Madigan's ethics. He had some questions about Madigan's House rules that dictate how the House is operated. And ultimately, he was blacklisted by not being given a clock that all the other Democrats got, by not seeing any of his legislation advance that Scott Drury wanted to advance. And that's all because he didn't support Madigan to be the Illinois House Speaker, being one of the first Democrats to actually vote against Madigan to be Speaker during Madigan's long tenure as the House Speaker. So they also heard from a utility official discussing, parties after various utility-favored legislation passed, and a variety of other issues. We're expected to see some testimony from current state representative Bob Rita. He was also prominent in the ComEd 4 trial. So it looks like a lot of the evidence, Dan, that prosecutors brought up against the ComEd 4 defendants are being rehashed for the Madigan trial.
Yeah, and that sort of makes sense, right, Greg? Because the 23 corruption counts against Madigan and McClain here, the vast majority of them have to do with Madigan's role in with ComEd. ComEd itself as a company essentially pleaded guilty in a deferred prosecution agreement a few years ago to currying favor with Madigan by hiring people he recommended to them to do nothing jobs. Essentially in exchange for favorable legislation to ComEd, making it through the state legislature. So there are lots of connections between the two cases, correct?
Yeah, no question. When they revealed that deferred prosecution agreement in the summer of 2020, it didn't name Madigan, but it was an agreement that ComEd entered with federal prosecutors to defer prosecution if they agreed that they took part in this alleged scheme. And then all of a sudden, all of the other information about Madigan's involvement in this came out, and emails were released talking about Madigan being, quote, our friend. And ultimately, in 2022, we get the 23 count indictment against Madigan and McClain. And then after that, it's not just ComEd. There was an allegation that of similar things with the former vice president of AT&T Illinois, which is a separate case, not being in front of Madigan this week. But clearly, a lot of concern of corruption circling Madigan after being the longest-serving state house speaker, who is also the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois, controlling the party purse. That nexus of power, the federal prosecutors are really looking to highlight in bringing former state legislators to the stand to witness and to testify to Madigan's power during his reign. So some pretty revealing things, especially in as far as Illinois' political machinery. And we're expecting to hear from a variety of other witnesses, including a politics professor, Dick Simpson, who is pretty intimate in the understandings of the Democratic Party machine in Illinois and in Chicago politics. So there's a lot more to come, Dan. This trial is expected to last well into December, if not into the new year.
I was going to ask you about that. Jury selection lasted a full 2 weeks, even trickled into this week. They do have 12 jurors now and 6 alternates. Prosecution gave its opening argument this week, followed by the 2 separate defendants, their attorneys giving their opening arguments. Testimony has started. But we're not even close for this thing to be wrapped up, right? You just mentioned maybe even into the new year.
Yeah, we're in it for the long haul. Our reporter in Chicago, Jim Talamonte, has been in there for all of what's going on, and also seeing Madigan and McClain walk in to the federal court building, and even witnessing them eating lunch in one other area. So, yeah, we've got eyes on this trial. We'll be updating people at thecentersquare.com.
Just one interesting side note on this. There's been a protester, I guess a Madigan protester, who's picketed outside of, as Michael Madigan has walked into the courthouse, with signs about corruption or whatever.
Yeah, I think the sign says shame in big capital letters.
Greg, the state of Illinois and plaintiffs in the consolidated federal challenge to Illinois' ban on more than 170 semi-automatic guns and rifles and magazines over certain capacities have filed their final written arguments in the case. The judge presiding over the case can issue a ruling almost any day or any week now. Tell us what was in those final closing statements.
Yeah, so Judge Stephen McGlynn, when he wrapped up the 4-day bench trial in this case in the Southern District of Illinois, gave litigants 30 days to file closing arguments, essentially. And he said that he wanted the filings to focus on text, history, and tradition of the Second Amendment and laws restricting access to firearms. Because the 4-day bench trial really delved into the difference between military firearms that go semi-automatic, burst, and full auto versus firearms that are available on the consumer markets readily that only do semi-automatic. Then we're thinking about really the AR-15. And that was a comparison that the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals made during the preliminary stage of this case. But the deadline came after 30 days, and earlier this week on Monday, those filings came, and from the state, they were the first to file their final briefs. They filed 3,500 plus pages of exhibits and their closing arguments. And that's a lot of paper. And even Judge McGlynn, earlier on in this case last year, he had made the statement he doesn't want to be papered to death. So we'll see just how much time he needs to go through those 3,500 plus pages of exhibits and other documents. And ultimately what the plaintiff said was, or rather what the state said as defense, they said that the plaintiffs have not met the burden, that these firearms need to be banned because of heightened societal concerns, and that they're too similar to military-grade firearms. But they asked the judge if a permanent injunction is issued in this case, they request a stay so that they can appeal. Essentially saying, if you do strike this law down, please put your ruling on hold so that we can have time to go appeal to the Seventh Circuit. While the plaintiffs responding to that say that that's a revelation to them that the state realizes their arguments aren't really going to cut muster in whether or not the state's gun ban is constitutional. One of the filings in the plaintiffs' briefs, which they filed several different ones, just highlighted how these firearms are commonly owned, and they are not military grade. They're semi-automatic only. There were even arguments about the parts and accessories that are being banned by this law, and saying that in order to have a operable, safe, and effective firearm, these parts are necessary. So this law should be struck down. So clearly, the arguments have been made. It's now in the judge's hands, and plaintiffs are wishful that Judge Stephen McGlynn will issue a permanent injunction just before the Thanksgiving holiday to give them and the Second Amendment community what they call Freedom Week. Now, if you recall, Dan, there was a so-called Freedom Week last year in late April that lasted 6 days. That was on preliminary grounds where Judge McGlynn struck down the law, and that lasted 6 days before the states got the appeals courts to essentially reverse that. But during that 6-day window, there was a lot of activity at retailers. Several I talked to back then said that they'd seen business they'd never seen before. But that 6-day window came to a close, and if people on day 5 went to go buy an AR-15, well, they didn't make it through that 3-day waiting period in order to pick that firearm up. So those firearms are essentially in limbo until another possible permanent injunction. But the big question is, if an injunction is issued by McGlynn in the district court, just how fast will the state run to the appeals court to get that reversed on appeal? So we're watching that closely, and we'll be keeping people updated at thecentersquare.com.
Greg, you're covering the case as an objective reporter. I'm going to ask you do you, like apparently the plaintiffs in the case, expect the judge to issue the injunction, but then the appeals court likely would put that on hold again?
That's the way this looks right now. Judge Stephen McGlynn, when he wrapped up the 4-day bench trial, reflected on the trial being held in East St. Louis. And he at first was questioning, well, why is it here? But then further thought about the history of East St. Louis and juxtaposing the ban on semi-automatic firearms with what happened in history in 1917 in East St. Louis. There was a race riot, essentially, where the black population was terrorized, and there were lynchings and buildings burned down. And McGlynn went through that history. And then he asked, what if the black population, the black victims in 1917 in East St. Louis had access to the firearms that we were debating during the bench trial? He says, who knows? So that really does give an indication as to where McGlynn may be leaning on this. And McGlynn's questions also during the trial were pretty poignant in talking about the importance of safe and effective firearms and how some of these attachments make them safe and effective for different people to be able to operate the firearm. So he's got a pretty, deep knowledge of firearms. But whether or not the state's going to sway him one way or the other, based off of previous Supreme Court precedent, we have yet to see. But McGlynn has options here. He could either say the state wins, he could say the plaintiffs win, or he could say the plaintiffs win, and I am going to put a stay on my order. So whether the Seventh Circuit picks up the case instantly or they wait several days, it is expected that the Seventh Circuits will reverse McGlynn's action if it's a permanent injunction. And that'll set up a fight for what happens in the Seventh Circuit down the road. But ultimately, this question, plaintiffs say, is going to be determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. Maybe not with Illinois' case, but maybe with a case out of Maryland that's already on the Supreme Court's docket to possibly be taken up for oral arguments. And that could happen sometime in the new term. Something else we'll be watching closely.
Thank you for that update, Greg. The administration of Governor J.B. Pritzker continues to be an Illinois population loss denier. There was a Better Government Association discussion about pensions in Chicago recently, and the subject of Illinois' ongoing population came up. But Deputy Governor Andy Maynard stepped in and tell our listeners what he said.
Yeah, so the question at the tail end of this hour-and-a-half conversation about pensions came from the Better Government Association's David Greising, and he was discussing some questions from the audience where somebody was discussing the economic trends in Illinois and just in passing said, like population decline. Well, Deputy Governor Andy Maynard jumped in and he says, I don't typically jump in on trying to correct things, but we have not lost population. Kind of caught Greising a little bit back. He was like, oh, but Maynard went on to say that no, we've never had more people in Illinois than ever before, and that we're gaining population. He said he pointed to the post-enumeration survey from the U.S. Census that revised Illinois' numbers upwards. But Dan, we've been tracking Illinois' population, not just from the U.S. Census, which puts out multiple updates every year from the state population to county population. They even give out numbers on state-to-state migration. And the most recent numbers indicate Illinois has lost another 93,000 people to other states. So we'll expect to see more of these types of numbers, but it's not just the U.S. Census that's highlighting this. There's Internal Revenue Service data that shows tax filers moving from one area to another, and Illinois is losing population when you look at the IRS migration data. It's not just federal government statistics, it's also statistics from the private sector like United Van Lines or like U-Haul, which regularly puts Illinois amongst the top states where people are moving out. So it's interesting to hear the Pritzker administration continue to say that Illinois is not losing population. Somebody else who's watching the population numbers closely, Ted Dabrowski with Wirepoints, I chatted with him about this, and he said that for the Pritzker administration to continue to deny population loss means that we're not really going to get the true substantive reforms that Dabrowski and Republicans and the minority in the state house say need to happen to reverse population decline. So if you don't recognize the problem, how are you going to solve it, is essentially what Dabrowski says. But clearly, we'll be watching those numbers because sometime just before Christmas, we'll have the latest annual census estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau. We'll be looking at Illinois, and then we'll be watching all of the other numbers from the IRS and the moving companies. And will we continue to see that downward trend in Illinois? Not sure, but we've had a decade of decline, and we lost a congressperson because of it. Another indication of Illinois' continued population loss.
Greg, remember that time a few years ago? What was it called? The COVID-19 pandemic, when Governor Pritzker was being questioned about his response to COVID-19, shutting down small businesses, shutting down schools, stay-at-home orders, mask mandates, vaccine mandates.
Remember, Dan, he also said that you could only have like 4 people on a boat.
That's right. But he was relying on the science and the data for that, right? And I remember hearing him say that over and over and over again, but he's not relying on the data here, it doesn't seem.
It's an interesting conundrum. Will they ever admit to population loss? Well, again, if they don't, then it's going to be difficult to get those reforms that some say is needed to reverse the trend.
That's right. Greg, we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna punt and throw you a curveball here, because we don't have time to talk about the 4 story we were going to talk about. We've got information recently. Just our own Kevin Bessler wrote about it for this morning, and that has to do with what kind of winter Illinois can expect. It's just around the corner, of course.
Wet and cold. This is the forecast from the Farmer's Almanac. And if your question is, am I looking forward to it? I am. I like fall. I like winter. I like seeing snow on the ground. I don't know about you guys up in the Chicagoland area, but I'm all for it. Bring it on.
You know, Greg, fall is great. I love fall weather, but when it starts turning from fall to winter and the white stuff starts falling, I've pretty much had enough of that.
Well, I'll tell you, Dan, I recently got a sauna before last winter, and it was incredible to get in the sauna and then get out and do a snow angel and then to get right back into the sauna. Nothing beats that.
Good for you. I can imagine that would be cool. We do not have a sauna here, Greg, so I can't do that. I have to shovel, freeze my tail off, and try and warm up with a cup of coffee.
Winter is coming.
It is coming. Greg, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.